Hello and welcome to Close Reading Classic Literature with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. Today I'm going to be looking at Emily Bronte's staggering, astonishing novel Wuthering Heights, which was first published in December 1847. One of the most stunning aspects of Emily Bronte's novel Wuthering Heights, I think, is its structure and how the structure of the novel plays with time and the revelation of the events in the story. So today I'm going to analyse the way that Emily Brontë plays with the plot in the novel Wuthering Heights. So plays with the structure. And for what effects? So why does she do that? To do this, I'm going to start by defining some of the literary terms that I'm going to be using. So I'm going to start by thinking about anachrony, or anachronic narrative. And to do that, I'm going to be looking at prolepsis and analepsis. And these are two ways that narratives can shift and play with time. And I'm going to include some examples of this from the text, so to see this prolepsis and analepsis in action. What was Emily Brontë trying to achieve in using these literary devices? Of course, that's always the question that you should ask yourself when you're doing any literary analysis. Why has the author chosen to do it in this way when they could have done it in another way? So I want to consider the effects of Bronte's anachronic narrative. The structure of Wuthering Heights is one of the aspects of the novel, I think, that makes it so arresting and indeed so innovative for its period. And not just because it innovatively has two central narrative voices. So much of the novel is a sort of dual parallel narrative involving Mr Lockwood and Nelly Dean. So Mr Lockwood is the newcomer to Gimmerton and Wuthering Heights. He is renting Thrushcross Grange. He is essentially the interloper outsider figure, perhaps aligned with the reader. Nelly Dean is very much the insider. She is the long-serving servant at both Thrushcross Grange and at Wuthering Heights, who has witnessed many of the events that make up the main narrative in the novel. And I just want to stop here quickly and think about the two names of the two houses in the story, because I cannot help but think that the reader should notice the difficulty of saying aloud Thrushcross Grange, compared with the ease of pronouncing aloud the eponymous Wuthering Heights. Rolls off the tongue to a much greater extent. And of course, Wuthering Heights is the title of the whole novel, so that should give the reader an idea of where our attention and where our focus should, and even perhaps where our sympathy, if that's the right word, should be. The sound of Wuthering Heights is dominated really by the vowel sounds, and it has soft consonant sounds. So it's dominated by I. Wuthering Heights, the vowel sounds. Whereas Thrushcross Grange, and you'll see that I find it quite difficult to say it aloud myself, Thrushcross Grange comprises a plethora of emphasised consonant sounds, and each word has the internal repetition of those consonant sounds. So there's the sibilance of the first word, the repeated S sound of Thrushcross, the S sound there, and the consonants, so the repeated consonants means repeated sounds of consonants of the repeated G sound in Grange. So the kind of closely packed, dense, if you like, sounds of the consonants of Thrushcross Grange make it harder to say, and hourly it's as if Thrushcross Grange is less easy to access, is less penetrable, and is somehow slightly out of reach perhaps, which is something to think about in terms of understanding the novel more broadly as a whole. If we think about Cathy Earnshaw and Heathcliff when they're children, for example, and the gaining access of Thrushcross Grange. So that was just a little side. To get back to the main point of the video, going back to the idea of the dual narrative. So we have the first narrative, the primary narrative, we might say, or the kind of main thrust of the story anyway, is Nelly Dean's narrative. So her recounting of past events to Mr Lockwood. We then have, you might say, the secondary narrative, which is Mr Lockwood's narrative. So he reports Nelly Dean's account of the story. So this dual narrative then, just the conceit of that being the structure, means that there is a kind of double remove from the events of the story. And again, as a sort of another separate point, both characters' reliability as a narrator is very questionable, but that is the topic for another day. And there are many things that I could say about this dual narrative as a literary device. And if you want me to talk about that more in another video and you're interested in that, then do leave your comments and thoughts below. But today I want to think about how Emily Bronte's narrative conceit relates to the way that the novel reveals the plot. How does the narrative structure reveal the events of the story to the reader, because they are not in chronological order? And why are they not in chronological order? Why does Emily Brontë choose to present the story in that way, not in chronological order? So as I've said, I'm going to include some examples of Emily Bronte's use of anachronic narrative. And I'm then going to close by examining a particular, I think, interesting example, moving on slightly, and think about the death of Heathcliff. Is Heathcliff's death an anticlimax? And if so, why does Emily Brontë write the death of her hero? Okay, you might think of him as an anti-hero, but he's the protagonist, he's the central character in the novel. So why does she write the death of this central character in a way that might be described as anticlimactic? To get on to the analysis then, what does the term anachrony mean as a literary device? What is an anachronic narrative? Well, fundamentally, an anachronic narrative plays with time and the sequencing of events in a plot, in the plot of a novel. So the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms defines anachrony as a term used in modern narratology. So narratology is the study or the analysis of narrative technique. So it's a term used in modern narratology to denote a discrepancy between the order in which events of the story occur, so you might say the chronology, and the order in which they are presented to us, to readers, in the plot. The story that's being told is one set, and the plot, the way in which that story is conveyed to readers, is a kind of another set. The original story or the events happen in linear order, but the way that the story is presented to readers, the ways that it is plotted through the narrative, is not in linear order. The novel Wuthering Heights starts in medias res, and that's the Latin for in the middle of things. And this is a standard device in epic poetry, for example. So Mr Lockwood arrives at Thrushcross Grange, visits his landlord Heathcliff at the house Wuthering Heights, and perceives that something is amiss. But he does not understand the tensions and relationships between the characters now residing at Wuthering Heights. So they are Heathcliff and Hareton Earnshaw and Mrs Heathcliff, who turns out to be Catherine Linton. Lockwood then determines to ask Nelly Dean, his housekeeper at Thrushcross Grange, about what has happened, as he remarks, hoping sincerely she would prove a regular gossip. That's in chapter 4. Nelly Dean then proceeds to recount those past events, to tell the story of what happened in the past to get the characters at the house Wuthering Heights to where they are now. So it starts in medias res, in the middle of things, because we've got to this point, and then the narrative goes back to see how we got to the middle of things. So where was the start? In terms of narrative plotting, in the present of Lockwood's narrative, she is describing the past, and this is called analepsis. So it might alternatively be called a flashback or retrospection, and analepsis comes from the Greek for take back. So a definition of analepsis, again from the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms, is that it's a form of anachrony by which some of the events of a story are related at a point in the narrative after later story events have already been recounted. So it's out of chronological order. You start in the middle and you go back, or you see the past. It's commonly referred to as retrospection or flashback. Analepsis enables a storyteller to fill in background information about characters and events. In a substantial part of the novel Wuthering Heights, Emily Brontë uses this technique, uses analeptic narrative. So Nelly Dean's main narrative dominates the majority of the novel. So this is from chapter 4, when Nelly Dean's prolonged narrative starts, up until chapter 30. Although there are intermittent interruptions from Lockwood, which reminds readers of the conceit of the novel's structure, which is that Nelly Dean's narrative is being told to another character who is then telling it to readers. I say the interruptions from Lockwood's present reminds readers of the conceits because one almost forgets, almost gets immersed in the present of Nelly Dean's narrative. In some sense, then, the novel has two time periods of the present that run throughout the novel. You have the main narrative, so from chapter 4 to 30 of Nelly Dean's narrative, which seems to be the present, and you keep being interrupted by Lockwood's narrative, present. And this disorientates the reader. The kind of apparently certain progression that one sort of expects of past, present, future, that you have that progression, you have that movement forward, and so on, that certainty seems to be unsettled or disrupted, and that idea is kind of enhanced by the structural conceit of having these kind of interrupting present times. So, for example, the central figure, well, the other central figure from Heathcliff, Cathy, or Cathy Earnshaw, who we might think of as the heroine, although again, as with Heathcliff, it's not really clear whether she's a heroine exactly or not. But she, the character, is only conveyed to readers through analepsis. We never meet her in the present. This is the present of Lockwood's narrative, because she is already dead before the novel starts. I should say we never meet her alive in Lockwood's narrative present, because the first time we encounter Cathy Earnshaw, Cathy, in the novel as readers is when she is a ghost. She is haunting Wuthering Heights. We meet her in death before we meet her in life. This is in chapter 3, when Mr Lockwood gets snowed in at Wuthering Heights and has to spend the night. And the child ghost Cathy wants to be let in at the window. This is the scene which I'm sure is known to many, celebrated in Kate Bush's wonderful song of Wuthering Heights from the 1970s, with its famous chorus, "Heathcliff, it's me, it's Cathy, I've come home, I'm so cold, let me in your window," etc. I won't sing anymore. But that kind of famous dramatic moment of when we first meet this character, although as I've said, of course, she is already dead. And of course this is all very dramatic and gothic and exciting and frightening and so on, but it should also alert the reader to the fact that time, the notion of past and present and future as a settled linear progression, is going to be played with and disturbed in the rest of the novel. And this, of course, is a deliberate narrative choice, narrative construction by Emily Brontë. She could have opened the novel, Wuthering Heights, in the narrative present of Nelly Dean's narrative. So she could have opened the novel and had one central narrative, one central time of the present at the beginning of harvest in the year 1771. So this is when Mr Earnshaw, the parent Earnshaw, returns from his trip to Liverpool, and he brings Heathcliff with him. So in terms of Wuthering Heights as it is, this is in chapter 4 when Nelly Dean commences her prolonged narrative. So Emily Brontë could just have started the novel, as I've said, when all the first generation central characters, the characters who we spend the most time with in the novel, were children. So Heathcliff, Cathy Earnshaw, Catherine Earnshaw, Hindley Earnshaw, Edgar Linton and Isabella Linton. Instead, the narrative opens 30 years later in 1801, when the first generation characters, so Heathcliff's generation, are already dead. Heathcliff is the only one of that generation who remains alive in the narrative present, in Lockwood's narrative present, apart, as I've said, from Cathy, who appears symbolically as a past presence in the present. Furthermore, readers are expressly told that all the first generation characters are already dead. So not only are they already dead, but we are expressly told that they are already dead. And we are told this by Nelly Dean before she commences her prolonged narrative, actually describing the events. She says, "Hareton is the last of them, the Earnshaws, as our Miss Cathy is of us, I mean of the Lintons." That's from chapter 4. And just again as another aside, but as I'm talking about time, the very first word of the novel is the date, 1801. Wuthering Heights, as I've said, was published in December 1847. The novel was set then about half a century before it was published. Even for the contemporary Victorian reader, the novel was overtly set in the past. From the very opening, from the very first word of the novel, then in the Victorian times as now, readers are confronted with time, with date. And so we should be aware of the significance of time in the rest of the novel. And what this does, I think, having this very particular time that was even removed from the time that the novel was first published, is that it creates a sense of distance, a sense of being removed from the heat of the action, a kind of lack of immediacy, because it's not even... Often when you read a novel and time isn't sort of a feature of it or isn't mentioned, it just could be happening today. And that's part of the point, that you read it and it could be going on right now. But that's very much not the case when the very first thing you're confronted with is a date 50 years ago. And this also then continues, I think, because we have this sense of unsettled time and distance and being removed from the heat of the action, because there's this chopping and changing throughout the whole novel of the very idea of time and the present time. But Emily Brontë chooses not to immerse the reader in one time. As I've said, Emily Brontë could have opened the novel in 1771 in the narrative present of Nelly Dean's story, when the central protagonists were children, and gone through the events in chronological order. She could have chosen to do that, but she did not. So the question then becomes, why? Why did she choose to present the events of the lives of the central characters in this anachronic way to readers? I think it has to do with Emily Bronte's very controlled and strategic use of anticlimax and the thwarting of readerly satisfaction, which I will get on to in a minute. But first, I want to consider prolepsis, which, as you might guess, is the opposite of analepsis. So analepsis derives, as I said, from the Greek for take back. Prolepsis derives from the Greek for take forward. And the definition of prolepsis in the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms is, in narrative works, a flash forward, or alternatively, we might think of this as an anticipation. So, in narrative works, a flash forward or anticipation by which a future event is related as an interruption to the present time of the narration. This is made even more complicated in Wuthering Heights because, as I said, we have these kind of two dual presents going on at the same time. We have an example of prolepsis early in Nelly Dean's narrative at the end of chapter 4. This is when Hindley Earnshaw and Heathcliff are fighting over a horse. So the text reads, Heathcliff had gone to loose the beast and shift it to his own stall. He was passing behind it when Hindley finished his speech by knocking him under its feet, and without stopping to examine whether his hopes were fulfilled, ran away as fast as he could. I was surprised to witness how coolly the child gathered himself up and went on with his intention, exchanging saddles and all, and then sitting down on a bundle of hay to overcome the qualm which the violent blow occasioned before he entered the house. I persuaded him easily to let me lay the blame of his bruises on the horse. He minded little what tale was told, since he had what he wanted. He complained so seldom indeed of such stirs as these, that I really thought him not vindictive. I was deceived completely, as you will hear. So the future events, Heathcliff's vindictive actions, are presaged by Nelly Dean's interruption of the present time of her telling the story. So she interrupts the present of the Heathcliff and the horse to tell of future events. Partially, of course, this is a conventional tool of novel writing in that it builds intrigue for the reader because, like Mr Lockwood, we are going to hear all about Heathcliff's vindictive shenanigans as well. But more than this, one might say that Emily Brontë here is using a kind of dual prolepsis. So we had the dual narrative and now we have the dual prolepsis because Nelly Dean interrupts the narrative of telling the story of Heathcliff as a child, and she also interrupts the recounting of the story to Lockwood. And there are two future times at play here. So in a sense you can see it as there being a past future and a present future here in this one moment. So Heathcliff's past future vindictive behaviour as he grows from a child to an adult and exacts his revenge on the other first generation characters. You might say that is past future, but you also have the present future in terms of Lockwood hearing the story, as you will hear in the future. In other words, the story is being taken forward in two ways. Another example of Emily Bronte's use of prolepsis occurs at the end of chapter 17, when Hindley Earnshaw has just died. The present time of Nelly Dean's narration is 1784, and Nelly Dean describes how this event will affect the future of Hareton Earnshaw, so how the death of the father will affect the future of the son. The text reads, "The guest," so that's Heathcliff, "the guest was now the master of Wuthering Heights. He held firm possession and proved to the attorney, who in his turn proved it to Mr Linton, that's Edgar Linton, that Earnshaw, that's Hindley Earnshaw, had mortgaged every yard of land he owned for cash to supply his mania for gaming, and he, Heathcliff, was the mortgagee. In that manner, Hareton, who should now be the first gentleman in the neighbourhood, was reduced to a state of complete dependence on his father's inveterate enemy, and lives in his own house as a servant deprived of the advantage of wages, quite unable to right himself because of his friendlessness and his ignorance that he has been wronged. The narrative present of 1784, so at the point of Hindley Earnshaw's death in Nelly Dean's narrative, is interrupted to tell of and anticipate Hareton Earnshaw's future a quarter of a century later. That quarter of a century later is simultaneously the narrative present of 1801, which is the present of Nelly Dean's recounting of the story to Mr Lockwood, where Hareton Earnshaw lives in his own house as servant, because Heathcliff remains the master of Wuthering Heights. And Emily Bronte's use of diction here beautifully, I think, exposes the dual time in these two sort of scenarios, because both present times are described using the word now. So in 1784, Heathcliff was now the master of Wuthering Heights. In 1801, Hareton should now be the first gentleman in the neighbourhood. So we have these two competing nows, which are sort of grappling for our attention. Now, there is a slight difference, of course, because the guest Heathcliff was now. So that is put in the past tense, was now. But even that is sort of slightly oxymoronic in a way. Whereas Hareton should now be the first gentleman, and he lives in his own house as a servant. So that is in the present tense. So that there is a slight difference between them, but still the reader, I think, is asked to juxtapose those two times because they're linked through the use of the word now. And the relationship between that point in the past at which Hindley Earnshaw died is expressly linked with how that event continues to affect the present, because what made Heathcliff master then continues to mean that Hareton lives as a servant to Heathcliff's master. So the events 25 years ago continue to affect the present 25 years later. And those two are kind of brought together or unified because Emily Brontë uses the word now to apply to both of those present times. If it's possible, I now want to complicate matters slightly. So Emily Bronte's use of proleptic narrative throughout Wuthering Heights is often not straightforward prolepsis because, as I've said, there are two presents operating throughout the novel. In terms of the structure of the novel, Nelly Dean's story uses prolepsis within analepsis. To summarise, in terms of the overall structure of the main section of the novel, so chapter 4 to chapter 30, there are two presents that run in parallel, as I've said. We've got the present of 1801, where the novel opens, where we come in. This is of Lockwood's present, essentially, Lockwood hearing Nelly Dean's tale. But we've also got the present of the events as they unfold during their retelling, so the present of Nelly Dean's story. And these two present times use different anachronic literary devices. So the present of Mr Lockwood hearing the story uses analepsis because events of the plot are related at a point in the narrative after later story events have been recounted, going back to the definition of analepsis. So if we have here 1801, this is Lockwood's present. He comes in the middle of things, is told comes into some of the events. So he sees the second generation, the children of the first generation at Wuthering Heights, completely in turmoil, etc., and wants to know how things got to be like that. Nelly Dean then goes back to the past and tells those past events to Lockwood. So that's analepsis. But the present of Nelly Dean's story has frequent interruptions and anticipations of the future. So it uses prolepsis. It anticipates future events in the narrative. So it looks forward in the narrative. Now, it looks forward in the narrative, but this is still the past when we are thinking about Lockwood's present. So we've got a situation which operates with these two narratives as both past and future simultaneously. I hope that makes some sense. And what this literary device achieves, this prolepsis within analepsis, in the example that I just gave previously, so the dual nows of Hindley Earnshaw's death prefiguring Hareton Earnshaw's future, which, as I've said, is Lockwood's present, is to highlight explicitly how past events continue to affect the characters that are still alive. In other words, it brings together or conflates the stories of the first generation of characters and the second generation of characters and shows them effectively in dialogue with one another. I want to close now by looking at a particularly important and interesting example, I think, of Emily Bronte's use of anachronic narrative. So this is not in the main section of the novel, which I have been dealing with so far, but in the 1802 section of the novel at the end. And this is the death of Heathcliff. So it is now September 1802. Mr Lockwood has been away from Yorkshire for 9 months when he returns again to Thrushcross Grange and Wuthering Heights. And this is a long quotation, but I think it's good to see how the death of Heathcliff is presented kind of in its context, so that you can see, so that what I say afterwards will hopefully make sense. So this is the text. Nelly Dean starts, "But step in, pray. Have you walked from Gimmerton this evening?" "From the Grange," I replied, "and while they make me lodging room there, I want to finish my business with your master, because I don't think of having another opportunity in a hurry." "What business, sir?" said Nelly, conducting me into the house. "He's gone out at present, and won't return soon." "About the rent," I answered. "Oh, then it is with Mrs Heathcliff you must settle," she observed, "or rather with me. She has not learnt to manage her affairs yet, and I act for her. There's nobody else." I looked surprised. "Ah, you have not heard of Heathcliff's death, I see," she continued. "Heathcliff? Dead?" I exclaimed, astonished. "How long ago?" 3 months since. But sit down and let me take your hat, and I'll tell you all about it. Stop. You have had nothing to eat, have you?" "I want nothing. I have ordered supper at home. You sit down too. I never dreamt of his dying. Let me hear how it came to pass. You say you did not expect them back for some time, the young people." "No, I have to scold them every evening for their late rambles, but they don't care for me. At least, have a drink of our old ale. It will do you good. You seem weary." She hastened to fetch it before I could refuse. I heard Joseph asking whether it... And my Joseph is pretty terrible, and I heard Joseph asking whether it warn't a crying scandal that she should have followers in her time of life, and then to get 'em jocks out of the master's cellar. He fair shamed to bide still and see it. She did not stay to retaliate, but re-entered in a minute, bearing a reaming silver pint whose contents I lauded with becoming earnestness, and afterwards she furnished me with the sequel of Heathcliff's history. He had a queer end, as she expressed it. So to unpick this a little bit more then, going back to the opening, "What business, sir," said Nelly, conducting me into the house. "He's gone out at present and won't return soon." This is when Lockwood has said that he has business with your master. Now, there is no mention here, Nelly makes no mention, that she is talking about Hareton Earnshaw. Your master is Hareton Earnshaw now. So Emily Brontë is playing with the reader here because we assume, like Lockwood, that she is talking about Heathcliff. It's kind of lulling us into a false sense of security that she is talking about Heathcliff. And we readers here might be kind of as frustrated as Lockwood is. You know, why would we have heard that Heathcliff had died? Why would Lockwood have heard? And of course, Emily Brontë knows that we would not have heard about it. So she's kind of deliberately playing with us, deliberately frustrating us there, not telling us, you know, that this change has occurred. And this is chapter 32 of 34. So having had this astonishing, as Lockwood says, shocking piece of news, the death of the protagonist, delivered so bluntly, we then have 2 chapters explaining how his death came to be. So again, we have a mixture of analepsis and prolepsis. Analepsis in one sense because Heathcliff has already died, so this is September 1802 and Heathcliff has already died in April 1802. Prolepsis in another sense though, because the announcement of Heathcliff's death appears to be the future interrupting the present in terms of the chronology of Nelly Dean's narrative. When Mr Lockwood returns to Wuthering Heights, Emily Brontë chooses to make us readers aware of the end of the story. That Heathcliff is dead, that Hareton Earnshaw and Mrs Heathcliff, née Catherine Linton, remain alive together and seemingly much happier. In other words, we are told briskly the what happens first, the climax of the story, if you like, the denouement, the thing that readers have been waiting to know. In many ways, the story of Wuthering Heights is the history of Heathcliff, and as Nelly Dean says, he has a queer end, and yet there is no kind of build up to that kind of queerness. It would be much more shocking probably if we had the narrative without already being told that Heathcliff was dead, if we'd just got the build up to Heathcliff's death. So her story as it sort of happens in chapters 33 and 34, that we could have just had those and we would have, our interest would have been kind of built up, and we would have gone along with that queerness and been swept up in that queerness and been more in the moment with that queerness. But, you know, the history of this character, Wuthering Heights being the history of this character, and his death is just thrown away, it's already happened, and we weren't told about it. It's sort of deliberately thwarting, deliberately anticlimactic, it seems to me, deliberately, in some ways, unsatisfying. So having had this what happened kind of bombshell dropped as though it were nothing, we are then given the hows and the whys. So what are the effects of this structure, this way of revealing the plot, such a key part of the plot, the key detail, in many ways a thing that the whole novel has been building up to? What are the effects of telling the narrative in this way? Anachronic narrative, the use of analepsis and prolepsis, is all about the management of the reader's anticipation. In a typical linear plot, where the events of the story are presented to the reader in chronological order, the what happens is the central thrust. So that's why you keep reading a page turner, because you want to know what happens next. And that is a great part of the excitement of reading many novels, that you have these kind of perpetual cliffhangers, this sort of cycle of cliffhanger resolution. So something happens, you want to know what happens next. Something happens, what happens next? Something happens, what happens next? It's a kind of cycle of anticipation and satisfaction, because your curiosity is piqued and what happens next, you find out what happens next. Ooh, then what happens next? You're satisfied because you find out what happens next. But Wuthering Heights is a novel that dispenses with this novelistic convention. And it's a novelistic convention for a very good reason, because it's satisfying. The what happens next plot is very satisfying, because you keep having your curiosity satisfied, and then it's piqued again, and then it's satisfied, and then it's piqued again. In fact, I would say Wuthering Heights, the novel's structure, determinedly thwarts the reader's potential excitement in anticipation, as here with Heathcliff's death. The reader does not really have any time to build up any excited anticipation about this big event, this enormous plot development, the death of the central character. Instead, as I've said, the moment is almost thrown away. It's over in a flash. It seems to be deliberate anticlimax, which is a deliberate thwarting of satisfaction. So why does Emily Brontë do this? What is the purpose? And just as a little aside again, it's very kind of peculiar details that Emily Brontë also adds in here. So we've got this kind of domestic setting to this scene, which also I think adds to this sense of anticlimax. So we are told about Joseph's unnecessary moaning and Nelly Dean's fussing about bringing in a pint of ale. And it's, you know, he's there because he wants to talk about paying the rent, you know, of all the unsexy topics to be sort of talking about. We've got, Joseph's moaning and Nelly Dean's fussing and, the kind of mundane, ordinary details of paying rent. So, and all this detail is kind of unnecessary and completely trivial compared with the momentous news in terms of the plot of the novel of the death of Heathcliff. And I would say it's kind of frustrating for the reader. But again, we are reminded of the fluidity of time. This is new news to us, but old news to them. And in a way, this strips out the sense of catharsis, the sense of release, which is where you get the satisfaction that readers usually experience at the denouement of a novel. One of the purposes, I think, is because I think it's designed to create a sense of inevitability in the narrative. That it isn't supposed to be a kind of an exciting surprise, this tale for the reader. That in some sense, the kind of inevitable unsatisfaction for the characters is mirrored in the sort of unsatisfactory non-climax that kind of happens repeatedly throughout Wuthering Heights. So, for example, with the death of both Cathy Earnshaw and later the death of Heathcliff, the reader knows of their deaths before they are described in the narrative. There's no jeopardy. We already know that they're going to die. And it's almost as if both characters choose to die because they see it as inevitable and the only way out of their present torment. And that applies to Cathy because she can't decide about can't decide about being the wife of Linton and her love for Heathcliff. And for Heathcliff because he can't, his revenge no longer satisfies him. It doesn't ultimately satisfy him. So these two characters are kind of tormented in the present and see death then as the only way out. There is a sense that in the novel, I think, that it had to be that way, that they had to die, that both of them were always going to die. They were fated to die, and that they both, because they both feel that way, that death is the only way out, that they both lean into death when it comes to them. And in that sense, the sense that they both saw themselves as doomed to die and so chose it, is fostered in the reader too, because we know that those characters do indeed die. So we readers know that they are going to die. So our conviction in the inevitability of their deaths mirrors their own. The feelings of these two characters then are enhanced and demonstrated and intensified, I would say, by the structure of the novel, by the non-linear way in which the anachronic narrative is presented to readers. Wuthering Heights is a novel all about not being satisfied. Cathy is not satisfied with her life as Mrs. Linton, and Heathcliff, for all his plans of vengeance and satisfying his hatred through revenge, is never satisfied. And even Mr. Lockwood is not satisfied with his time in Yorkshire. As Heathcliff says in the novel's final chapter, effectively on his deathbed confession, "I'm too happy, and yet I'm not happy enough." It's kind of paradoxical state of being. "My soul's bliss kills my body, but does not satisfy itself." So this is in the final chapter when the kind of central character is having his final words, and it's about not being satisfied. So I think here the sense of anticlimax for readers echoes the characters, many characters' own feelings of not being satisfied. And I think Emily Bronte's anachronic narrative is designed not to satisfy, but to unsettle and frustrate, and to suggest that the past can never quite be left in the past. Thank you very much indeed for listening. Remember, if you like what I do here on my channel where I analyse classic literature, then do subscribe. And if you have liked the video, then do press the thumbs up button. It does help me out, as I always say, in YouTube's algorithm. And I'd love to know, what do you think of Emily Bronte's use of anachronic narrative, the way that she plays with time in Wuthering Heights? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below.